Hello everyone, welcome back to another story. Before we get started, comment below where you're from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. The snow began falling over Burlington, Vermont on the morning of December 18, 2012. Soft and deliberate, the kind of snow that transforms ordinary streets into something out of a storybook. The flakes drifted down through bare maple branches and settled on rooftops already decorated with Christmas lights, adding another layer of white to a town that had seen its share of cold winters. By noon, nearly 2 inches had accumulated on Maple Ridge Lane, a quiet residential street on the eastern edge of the city, where modest homes sat close together, their chimneys releasing thin ribbons of smoke into the gray December sky. At number 47 Maple Ridge Lane, a small colonial house with green shutters and a wraparound porch, 10-year-old Lucas Bennett sat at the kitchen table, his tongue pressed against his upper lip in concentration as he colored the final panel of his homemade comic book. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and baking bread. And through the window, Lucas could see the snow continuing to fall, covering the driveway where his father's pickup truck should have been parked, but hadn't been for nearly 8 months. Lucas was a small boy for his age, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and serious gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with quiet intensity. He was the kind of child who noticed details that others missed, who spent recess sketching in the corner of the playground rather than playing kickball, who had taught himself to draw by copying panels from his father's old comic book collection stored in cardboard boxes in the basement. His teachers described him as thoughtful. His classmates called him weird. His father called him an artist. The comic book spread across the kitchen table was titled Captain Dad and the Battle for Christmas, and Lucas had been working on it for 6 weeks, ever since his mother had told him that his father wouldn't be coming home for the holidays. Staff Sergeant David Bennett was stationed at Forward Operating Base Sharana in Afghanistan's Paktika province, and the nature of his current mission meant that no leave would be granted until at least February. The news had devastated Lucas, who had marked the days on his calendar, who had been counting down to the moment when his father's truck would pull into the driveway and everything would feel normal again. So Lucas had decided to send Christmas to his father instead. The comic book told the story of a superhero named Captain Dad who had to save Christmas from an army of ice monsters. The hero looked exactly like David Bennett, with his broad shoulders and square jaw, and the small scar above his left eyebrow that he'd gotten from a baseball when he was 12. In the story, Captain Dad fought through blizzards and scaled frozen mountains and defeated the ice monsters not with weapons, but with the power of his family's love, represented in the comic as a glowing shield that protected him from all harm. The final panel, which Lucas was finishing now, showed Captain Dad standing in front of a small house with green shutters, his arms wrapped around a woman and a boy who looked remarkably like Sarah and Lucas Bennett. "Almost done, sweetheart?" Sarah Bennett called from the living room, where she was wrapping the last of the presents that would go under their modest tree. 5 more minutes, Lucas called back, carefully adding a golden glow around the shield in the final panel. "I want it to be perfect." Sarah smiled to herself as she smoothed a ribbon on a package. Lucas had been so withdrawn since David's deployment, spending hours alone in his room, barely speaking at dinner, crying himself to sleep some nights when he thought she couldn't hear. The comic book project had been a lifeline for him, giving him something to focus on, something to pour his love and longing into. She had watched him work on it every day after school, had seen him erase and redraw panels until they met his exacting standards, had heard him talking to himself as he worked out plot points and dialogue. The finished product was remarkable for a 10-year-old, 22 pages of carefully drawn and colored panels that told a story of heroism and family and hope. The package sat on the counter near the door, already addressed in Lucas's careful handwriting. Sarah had helped him find the right size padded envelope, had shown him how to fill out the customs form required for military mail, had weighed the package at the post office to make sure he had enough postage. The stamps featured the American flag, which Lucas had chosen specifically because he knew his father would like them. All that remained was getting the package to the mailbox. Lucas finished the final stroke of gold and sat back to admire his work. The hero in the panel seemed to glow with inner light, his arms wrapped protectively around his family, his face showing the kind of peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. Lucas carefully closed the comic book, slid it into a protective plastic sleeve he had bought with his own allowance money, and then placed it inside the padded envelope. He sealed it with 3 strips of tape, wanting to make absolutely sure it wouldn't open during its long journey across the ocean. "Mom," he said, carrying the package into the living room. "Can I take this to the mailbox now? I want Dad to get it before Christmas." Sarah looked up from her wrapping. Through the window she could see the snow falling steadily, the street already covered in white. The mailbox was at the corner, maybe 200 yards from their front door, visible from the kitchen window. Lucas had walked to it dozens of times before to get the mail or to mail letters to his grandmother in Florida. It was a safe street, a quiet street, the kind of street where neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for each other's children. "It's snowing pretty hard, honey," she said. "Can it wait until tomorrow?" "But Mom, the mail carrier already came today. If I put it in the mailbox now, it'll get picked up first thing tomorrow morning. If I wait, it might not get to Dad in time." Sarah hesitated. Lucas so rarely asked for anything these days, so rarely showed enthusiasm for anything other than his art. The mailbox was right there, easily visible from the kitchen, and the look on his face, that mixture of hope and determination, reminded her so much of David that it made her chest ache. "Okay," she said, "but put on your coat and hat, and come right back." Lucas was already pulling on his winter coat, the red one with the hood that made him look like a small Christmas elf. He stuffed the package inside his coat to protect it from the snow, zipped up, and pulled on his knit cap. His boots were by the door, and he shoved his feet into them without bothering to tie the laces. "I'll watch from the window," Sarah said. "Straight there and straight back, understand?" "I know, Mom." Lucas opened the front door, and a gust of cold air swirled into the house, carrying snowflakes that melted on the hardwood floor. He stepped out onto the porch, his breath visible in the frigid air, and turned to wave at his mother. "I'll be right back." Sarah watched him descend the porch steps and start down the sidewalk, his red coat a bright spot against the white snow. She moved to the kitchen to check on the bread she had baking in the oven, positioning herself so she could see out the window over the sink. Lucas was halfway to the corner now, walking carefully in the accumulating snow, the package clutched against his chest. The timer on the oven beeped. Sarah turned to check it, opening the oven door to test the bread with a toothpick. The toothpick came out clean. She pulled on her oven mitts and removed the loaf pan, setting it on a cooling rack on the counter. The whole process took perhaps 30 seconds, maybe 45 at most. When she looked back out the window, the street was empty. For a moment, Sarah didn't register what she was seeing. Her eyes scanned the white expanse of snow, looking for the bright red of Lucas's coat. He must have reached the mailbox, she thought. He must be coming back now, maybe taking a different path, maybe making a snowball to throw at the fence. But the street remained empty. There was no red coat, no small figure trudging through the snow, no sign of her son anywhere. Sarah felt the first stirring of unease in her stomach. She moved to the front window for a better view, pressing her face against the cold glass. From here, she could see the blue mailbox on the corner, could see the footprints in the snow leading toward it. But the footprints simply stopped. There was no trail leading back. "Lucas?" she called, opening the front door. Her voice echoed in the silent street. "Lucas." No answer came, just the soft whisper of falling snow and the distant sound of a car passing on the main road. Sarah grabbed her coat and ran out of the house, not bothering with shoes, her stockinged feet sinking into the snow as she sprinted toward the corner. She reached the mailbox and found herself standing in a nightmare. The snow around the mailbox was disturbed, churned up as if by a brief struggle. And there, lying half-buried in a snowdrift, was the package Lucas had been carrying, the envelope torn open, the comic book's plastic sleeve cracked and dirty from being trampled. Sarah screamed her son's name. She screamed it until her throat was raw, until neighbors began emerging from their houses, until someone called 911, and the sound of sirens began to pierce the silent afternoon. She screamed until she had no voice left, standing alone in the snow on a street that had suddenly become the most terrifying place in the world. Lucas Bennett had vanished. The first police officer arrived at 3:47 p.m., 11 minutes after the initial 911 call. Officer James Morrow was a 20-year veteran of the Burlington Police Department who had handled everything from bar fights to domestic disputes. But the sight of Sarah Bennett standing barefoot in the snow, her face contorted in anguish, her voice reduced to a hoarse whisper as she repeated her son's name over and over, told him immediately that this was something different, something worse. By 4:15 p.m., Maple Ridge Lane was swarming with police vehicles. Detectives arrived, then forensic technicians, then officers who began the grim task of searching every yard, every garage, every shed within a quarter-mile radius. A K-9 unit was dispatched, and a German shepherd named Duke was given one of Lucas's T-shirts to scent. The dog led his handler down the sidewalk to the mailbox, circled the disturbed snow 3 times, and then simply stopped, confused. The scent trail ended there, as if Lucas had simply evaporated into the winter air. As darkness fell over Burlington, the search expanded. Volunteers from the community began gathering at the elementary school, forming search parties that fanned out across the neighborhood with flashlights. The local news stations interrupted their regular programming with breaking coverage. The headline scrolled across every television screen in Vermont. 10-year-old boy missing in Burlington. Sarah Bennett sat in her living room, surrounded by police officers and detectives and neighbors who had come to help, but could do nothing but wait. She had told her story so many times that the words had become meaningless syllables, a recitation of facts that she couldn't quite believe were real. Her son had been walking to the mailbox. She had looked away for 30 seconds. When she looked back, he was gone. One of the detectives, a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, pulled up a video on his laptop. A neighbor 3 houses down had a security camera mounted above their garage, and the footage had been recovered within an hour of the initial report. The video was grainy, shot at a low frame rate, the image further obscured by falling snow. But it showed Maple Ridge Lane at 3:31 p.m., and it showed something that made every law enforcement officer in the room lean forward with focused attention. A vehicle was visible at the edge of the frame, parked near the corner where the mailbox stood. The shape suggested a sedan, though the model was impossible to determine through the snow and low resolution. The vehicle appeared to be dark in color, perhaps blue or black or dark green, and as the timestamp on the video ticked forward, the sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared from view, heading north on Maple Ridge Lane. "Do we have anything else?" Detective Chen asked. "Any other cameras? Any witnesses?" The answer came back negative. In 2012, home security cameras were not yet ubiquitous. The neighbor's garage camera was the only one on the street, and it had captured just this single, frustratingly incomplete glimpse. No one had seen the vehicle arrive. No one had seen it leave. No one had seen anything at all. The investigation would come to call it The Ghost Sedan. 8,000 miles away, at Forward Operating Base Sharana, in Afghanistan's Paktika province, Staff Sergeant David Bennett was cleaning his rifle when his commanding officer appeared in the doorway of his quarters with an expression that David had seen before. It was the expression that came before the worst possible news. "Bennett," the officer said, "there's been an emergency at home. You need to come with me." David's first thought was that something had happened to Sarah. A car accident, maybe, or some kind of medical emergency. His mind raced through possibilities as he followed his commander to the communications center, where a secure line had been established. His hands were steady, trained by years of military discipline, but his heart was pounding against his ribs. The voice on the other end of the line was his mother-in-law's, and she was crying so hard that David could barely understand her words. But he understood enough. His son. Gone. Missing. No one knew where he was. The floor seemed to tilt beneath David's feet. He gripped the edge of the communications desk, knuckles turning white, as his mother-in-law's voice continued to pour out details he couldn't process. Walking to the mailbox. 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. The package in the snow. The police. The search parties. No sign. No sign of Lucas anywhere. David Bennett had seen combat in 3 different countries. He had been shot at, bombed, and ambushed. He had watched friends die and had killed enemies, and had developed the kind of emotional calluses that allowed soldiers to function in impossible situations. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Nothing could have prepared him for the sensation of his entire world collapsing into a single point of terror and grief. "I'm coming home," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, flat and mechanical. "I'm coming home right now." The military moved with unusual speed. Emergency leave was granted within hours, and David was on a transport flight out of Afghanistan before sunrise the next morning. He flew through the night, changing planes in Germany, and then again in New York, arriving in Burlington 31 hours after he had first received the news. He hadn't slept. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lucas's face, heard Lucas's voice, imagined his son calling out for help that wasn't coming. The house on Maple Ridge Lane was unrecognizable when David's taxi pulled up to the curb. Police tape surrounded the front yard. News vans lined the street. Officers and volunteers moved in and out of the command post that had been established in the elementary school parking lot 2 blocks away. And Sarah stood on the front porch, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes red from crying, looking like a ghost of the woman he had married. David held her, and she collapsed against him. And they stood there in the cold December air, 2 parents clinging to each other while their world burned down around them. Somewhere out there, in the darkness of a Vermont winter, their son was missing. And neither of them knew if they would ever see him again. The investigation that followed would become one of the most intensive in Vermont history. Over the next 3 weeks, more than 200 law enforcement officers participated in the search for Lucas Bennett. Divers searched the frozen waters of Lake Champlain. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the surrounding forests. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields and parks and abandoned properties, looking for any sign of the missing boy. The Ghost Sedan became the focus of intense scrutiny. Detectives interviewed every car owner in Burlington, checked registration records, followed up on hundreds of tips from citizens who thought they had seen a suspicious vehicle. The grainy footage from the neighbor's security camera was analyzed by FBI experts who determined only that the vehicle was likely a sedan, likely dark-colored, and likely manufactured sometime between 2000 and 2010. The make and model could not be determined. The license plate was not visible. David Bennett threw himself into the search with the intensity that had made him an effective soldier. He walked the streets of Burlington every day, knocking on doors, handing out flyers with his son's picture, asking anyone who would listen if they had seen anything. He barely slept, barely ate, drove himself to the point of collapse, and then pushed further. His superiors in the army granted him extended leave, understanding that this was not a man who could return to duty while his son's fate remained unknown. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks began to turn into months, and no trace of Lucas Bennett was found. The package he had been carrying, the comic book he had worked so hard to create, remained in evidence storage, its pages water-stained and torn. The trail had gone cold almost immediately, frozen solid like the Vermont winter itself. In February 2013, the active search was officially scaled back. The case remained open, but the dozens of officers assigned to it were reduced to a handful. The news coverage, which had been constant in those first terrible weeks, faded to occasional updates and anniversary stories. The volunteers who had walked the fields went back to their normal lives. The command post at the elementary school was dismantled. But David Bennett did not stop. He could not stop. He walked the street every night, from his house to the mailbox and back, retracing the steps his son had taken on that December afternoon. He studied the security footage until he could see it with his eyes closed, convinced that there was something there, some detail he had missed, some clue that would reveal itself if he just looked hard enough. He created a dedicated room in the house, covering the walls with maps and photographs and timelines and theories, a shrine to an investigation that had become his entire life. The Army could not grant him leave forever. In June 2013, David was informed that he needed to either return to duty or accept a medical discharge. He chose the discharge without hesitation. His military career, which had spanned 15 years and 4 combat deployments, ended with a form and a handshake. David barely noticed. His career meant nothing compared to finding his son. Sarah watched her husband spiral deeper into obsession, and she understood because she felt the same desperate need. But where David channeled his grief into action, Sarah found herself paralyzed, unable to function, unable to think about anything except those 30 seconds when she had looked away. She should have walked him to the mailbox. She should have stood on the porch and watched. She should have done something, anything, differently. The guilt was a living thing inside her, eating her from within. By the end of the first year, the marriage was showing serious cracks. David's obsession left no room for anything else, no room for connection or comfort or the small daily rituals that hold a relationship together. Sarah sought help from a therapist, tried to find ways to cope, but David refused to join her. He didn't have time for therapy. He was too busy walking the streets, too busy studying the footage, too busy waiting for a break in the case that never came. The second year was worse. David had exhausted every conventional avenue of investigation and had begun pursuing increasingly desperate theories. He hired a private investigator, then another, then a third. He consulted psychics. He followed tips that led nowhere, driving hundreds of miles to check out reported sightings that turned out to be other children, other families, other tragedies. Each dead end broke something inside him, but he always picked up the pieces and started again. Sarah filed for separation in March 2014. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, the catch-all phrase that covered everything and nothing. The real reason was simpler and more terrible. She could not watch her husband destroy himself any longer. She could not live in a house that had become a memorial, could not share a bed with a man who spent his nights walking a street where their son had vanished, could not go on pretending that there was any kind of normal life possible in the shadow of this grief. David signed the papers without protest. He understood, in some distant part of his mind that still functioned rationally, that Sarah was right to leave. He had become someone she didn't recognize, someone he didn't recognize. but he couldn't stop. Stopping meant accepting that Lucas might never be found, might never come home, might be gone forever. And that was something David Bennett could not do. The divorce was finalized in November 2014. Sarah moved to her sister's house in Connecticut, where she slowly, painfully began to rebuild some version of a life. David stayed in the house on Maple Ridge Lane, alone with his maps and his theories, and his nightly walks to the mailbox where the world had ended. The town of Burlington tried to help. Neighbors brought food that David barely touched. The police liaison officer, a kind woman named Detective Alice Morrison, checked in regularly with updates that were always the same. No new leads, no new evidence, no progress. A fund was established in Lucas's name to help other families of missing children, and the community donated generously, perhaps hoping that their money could accomplish what prayers and searches had not. Every December 18th, on the anniversary of Lucas's disappearance, a ceremony was held on Maple Ridge Lane. Residents gathered with blue ribbons tied to their coats, the color Lucas's mother said was his favorite, and they released balloons into the gray winter sky. They listened to speeches from the mayor and the police chief, and anyone else who wanted to express solidarity with the Bennett family. They lit candles and held hands, and sang songs that seemed inadequate to the weight of what they were commemorating. David attended every ceremony, standing alone at the edge of the crowd, his eyes distant, his face carved into lines of permanent grief. He never spoke at these events, never joined in the singing, never accepted the hugs and condolences offered by well-meaning neighbors. He just stood there, watching the balloons rise until they disappeared from view, and then he walked home to continue his vigil. The years passed with terrible slowness. 2015, 2016, 2017. The case file grew thicker, filled with dead ends and false leads, and the accumulated paperwork of an investigation that had stalled but never officially closed. Detectives came and went, rotating through the cold case unit, each one spending a few months reviewing the evidence before moving on to more promising cases. The ghost Sedan remained a ghost, never identified, never found. David's health began to deteriorate. He had aged decades in just a few years, his hair turning gray, his face gaunt, his body weakened by neglect and sleeplessness. The VA doctors who examined him warned of blood pressure issues, of nutritional deficiencies, of the physical toll that chronic stress was taking on his system. David nodded at their advice and ignored it, just as he ignored everything that didn't relate to finding Lucas. He had become a familiar figure in Burlington, this hollow-eyed man who walked the same route every night, regardless of weather, who spent his days at the library researching investigative techniques, who showed up at police headquarters every few weeks to ask if there had been any developments. Most people in town knew his story. Most felt sorry for him. A few, perhaps, had begun to whisper that David Bennett had lost his mind. But David knew something that the whisperers did not. He knew that somewhere out there was a person who knew what had happened to Lucas. Someone had driven that ghost sedan. Someone had been watching, had waited, had taken his son. And that someone was still out there, going about their life, while Lucas's fate remained a mystery. The thought kept David going through the darkest nights, through the moments when he stood at the mailbox and considered simply lying down in the snow and never getting up. Somewhere, the person responsible was living and breathing and getting away with it. And as long as that was true, David could not stop. In 2018, a break seemed possible. A convicted child predator in New Hampshire was being investigated for a series of crimes dating back to the early 2000s. One of the detectives on the case noticed similarities to the Lucas Bennett disappearance and reached out to Burlington police. David's hopes, which he had learned to suppress after so many disappointments, flared to life. But the investigation went nowhere. The New Hampshire predator had an alibi for December 18, 2012, confirmed by prison records. He had been incarcerated for an unrelated offense at the time of Lucas's disappearance. Another dead end. Another crushing disappointment. Sarah, who had remarried in 2017 and was living in Massachusetts now, called David after she heard about the New Hampshire lead. It was one of their rare conversations, awkward and painful, two people bound together by a tragedy they could never escape. She asked how he was doing. He said he was fine. They both knew it was a lie. "You need to let go, David," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You need to find a way to live again. Lucas wouldn't want this for you." "I can't," David replied. "I can't let go until I know what happened to him." "What if you never know? What if this is something we have to live with forever?" David couldn't answer that question. The possibility that Lucas's fate would remain forever unknown was something he had never allowed himself to contemplate. It was the abyss at the center of his existence, and he had spent the past 6 years building walls around it to keep from falling in. The conversation ended with nothing resolved, as their conversations always did. Sarah went back to her new life, her new husband, her therapy appointments, and her quiet grief. David went back to his walks, his research, his waiting. By 2020, the investigation had been effectively dormant for years. A new generation of detectives had cycled through the cold case unit, none of them finding anything their predecessors had missed. The evidence from the scene, preserved in climate-controlled storage, had been tested and retested with every new forensic technique that became available. Nothing useful had emerged. The package Lucas had been carrying, the torn envelope with its flag stamps and careful handwriting, sat in an evidence locker, gathering dust. The comic book inside, Captain Dad and the Battle for Christmas, had been photographed and catalogued but never returned to David. He had asked about it once, in the early days of the investigation, but had been told it was evidence and couldn't be released. He hadn't asked again. The COVID-19 pandemic swept through Vermont in 2020 and 2021, and the world seemed to pause, everyone retreating into their own private fears and isolations. The annual Blue Ribbon ceremony was canceled for the first time in 8 years, replaced by a virtual gathering that David did not attend. He continued his walks, now wearing a mask, passing through streets that had become eerily empty. In his more lucid moments, David recognized that he had become a kind of ghost himself, haunting the neighborhood where his son had disappeared, unable to move forward, unable to let go. He was 62 years old now, his military pension barely covering his expenses, his health declining, his connections to the outside world almost entirely severed. He had outlived his purpose without finding the resolution he needed. And then, in early 2024, everything changed. The Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit had undergone significant changes since the Lucas Bennett case first landed on their desks. New leadership, new technologies, new methodologies had transformed the way cold cases were investigated. Detective Marisol Vega, who had taken over the unit in 2022, had made it her mission to review every unsolved case with fresh eyes, applying forensic techniques that hadn't existed when the original investigations were conducted. The Lucas Bennett case came across her desk in January 2024. Vega read through the file, which filled 3 cardboard boxes with paperwork, evidence logs, and interview transcripts. She studied the grainy footage of the ghost sedan. She reviewed the physical evidence that had been collected from the scene, and she became convinced that there was more to be found. One piece of evidence had never been fully analyzed: the envelope Lucas had been carrying. In 2012, the envelope had been dusted for fingerprints and examined for trace evidence, but the results had been inconclusive. The stamps and paper had absorbed moisture from the snow, degrading any biological material that might have been present. The forensic technology of the time simply couldn't extract usable evidence from such a compromised sample. But technology had advanced considerably in 12 years. A technique called M-Vac had been developed specifically for extracting DNA from porous surfaces. The method used a sterile solution to wet the surface, then a vacuum system to collect the liquid along with any biological material it contained. It had proven remarkably effective at recovering DNA from materials that had defeated traditional collection methods. Detective Vega submitted the envelope for M-Vac analysis in late January 2024. She didn't expect much. After 12 years and multiple previous tests, the chances of finding anything useful seemed slim. But cold case work was built on slim chances, on the willingness to try even when success seemed unlikely. Sometimes that's all it took. The results came back in February 2024, and when Vega opened the report, she felt her heart begin to race. The M-Vac analysis had recovered epithelial cells, skin cells, from the adhesive strip of the envelope. This was the area where someone would lick the envelope to seal it, or where someone might touch the envelope while handling it. The DNA profile generated from these cells did not match Lucas Bennett. It did not match Sarah Bennett or David Bennett. It belonged to someone else entirely. For the first time in 12 years, the investigation had a new lead. The DNA profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, but no direct match was found. This meant the person whose skin cells were on the envelope had never been convicted of a crime requiring DNA collection, had never volunteered their DNA to any database. A direct identification would not be possible through conventional means. But there was another option: genetic genealogy. This investigative technique, which had exploded in popularity after the Golden State Killer was identified through distant relatives in 2018, used consumer DNA databases to find relatives of an unknown person. By building out family trees from these matches, investigators could sometimes narrow down the identity of the person they were seeking. Detective Vega reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. She explained the case, the evidence, the 12 years of dead ends. Parabon agreed to take it on, assigning one of their top genetic genealogists to build a family tree from the DNA profile. The work was painstaking and time-consuming. Genetic genealogy requires tracing connections through generations, identifying common ancestors, eliminating branches that don't fit the evidence. Weeks passed as the genealogist worked her way through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death records. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The DNA profile pointed to a specific branch of a family that had lived in Vermont for generations. The genealogist identified a probable parent generation, then began narrowing down to individuals who fit the demographic profile. The person whose DNA was on the envelope was likely male, probably between the ages of 40 and 60, and almost certainly living in or near Burlington at the time of Lucas's disappearance. On March 3, 2024, the genealogist delivered her final report to Detective Vega. The most likely match for the DNA profile was a man named Paul Grady. He was 57 years old, a lifelong resident of Burlington. He had no criminal record, no previous contact with law enforcement regarding the Bennett case or any other investigation. By all appearances, he was an ordinary citizen leading an ordinary life. But one detail in his background made Detective Vega's blood run cold. Paul Grady had been employed by the United States Postal Service since 1997. For 15 years, he had delivered mail to the residents of Maple Ridge Lane. He had been Lucas Bennett's mail carrier. The revelation sent shockwaves through the cold case unit. This was not a stranger abduction, not a random predator who had happened upon a vulnerable child. The man whose DNA was on the envelope had known the Bennett family. He had walked up to their door hundreds of times, had exchanged pleasantries with Sarah, had probably seen Lucas playing in the yard. He had been hiding in plain sight for 12 years. More importantly, his role as a mail carrier explained something that had puzzled investigators from the beginning. How had the abductor gotten away without being seen? On that December afternoon, with snow falling and visibility reduced, a mail truck parked near a mailbox would have been invisible in a way that any other vehicle would not. No one notices the mail carrier. No one pays attention to a postal vehicle. It's part of the landscape, as unremarkable as a fire hydrant or a traffic light. The ghost sedan had been a red herring all along. The grainy footage that David Bennett had studied for thousands of hours had captured a passing car. Nothing more. The real threat had arrived in a vehicle that no one thought to mention, because no one thought it was relevant. Detective Vega assembled a team to investigate Paul Grady while maintaining strict secrecy. Any leak could alert him, give him time to destroy evidence or flee. Background checks revealed that Grady had retired from the Postal Service in 2019 and was now living alone in a house on the outskirts of Burlington. He had never married, had no children, had few apparent social connections. His property records were examined. His financial history was scrutinized. His movements were discreetly monitored. Nothing overtly suspicious emerged, but Vega knew that meant nothing. The most dangerous predators were often the most careful at concealing their true nature. The breakthrough came when investigators obtained Grady's Postal Service records. On December 18, 2012, Paul Grady had been scheduled for Route 47, which included Maple Ridge Lane. His timesheet showed that he completed his deliveries that day without incident, returning his vehicle to the depot at 4:15 p.m., roughly 45 minutes after Lucas Bennett disappeared. 45 minutes. The window of time when Grady could have grabbed Lucas, transported him somewhere in his official vehicle, and then returned as if nothing had happened. The window when he could have committed a terrible crime and then hidden in the most effective camouflage possible, the mundane routine of everyday work. Detective Vega knew she had enough for an arrest warrant, but she wanted more. She wanted evidence that would make the case airtight, that would give the Bennett family the closure they had been denied for so long. She requested a search warrant for Paul Grady's property. On March 15, 2024, at 6 a.m., a team of law enforcement officers arrived at Paul Grady's house. They found him sitting at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, looking for all the world like an innocent retiree enjoying his morning routine. He offered no resistance when they presented the warrant. He asked no questions when they began searching his home. What they found would haunt the investigators for years to come. In the basement of Paul Grady's house, hidden behind a false wall that looked like it had been in place for decades, was a small room. The room contained photographs, dozens of them, all depicting children from the neighborhood where Grady had delivered mail. Most of the photographs appeared to have been taken surreptitiously, from a distance, capturing children playing in yards or walking to school. They were dated, going back to the late 1990s. In a locked box inside the hidden room, investigators found personal items: a hair ribbon, a small sneaker, a library card. And among these items, perfectly preserved in a plastic sleeve, was a school ID card bearing the face and name of Lucas Bennett. Paul Grady was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. He was read his rights, placed in handcuffs, and transported to the Burlington Police Department for questioning. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not protest his innocence. He sat in the interrogation room and stared at the wall with an expression that might have been relief. Detective Vega conducted the interrogation herself. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing questions, anticipating responses, steeling herself for whatever horrors might be revealed. But nothing could have fully prepared her for what Paul Grady had to say. He confessed within the first hour. The words poured out of him in a flat, emotionless monotone, as if he were reciting facts about someone else's life. He described how he had watched Lucas Bennett for months, had noted the boy's routines, had fantasized about taking him. He described the planning, the careful selection of a day when snow would provide cover and witnesses would be scarce. He described the moment itself, pulling his mail truck alongside the mailbox, calling out to Lucas as the boy approached, offering to take the package and save him a trip in the cold. Lucas had trusted him. Of course, Lucas had trusted him. Paul Grady was the mail carrier, a familiar face, a symbol of safety and routine. The boy had climbed into the truck without hesitation, probably grateful for the ride back home. He had no way of knowing that he would never see his home again. Grady described what happened next in terms that the investigators would later redact from public records. The details were too horrific, too painful, too damaging to release. What mattered, for the purposes of the investigation, was the outcome. Lucas Bennett had died on December 18, 2012, within hours of his abduction. The location where Grady had taken him was a property in rural Vermont, a hunting cabin that had belonged to Grady's father and had sat abandoned for years. Grady led investigators to the site, walking them through woods still covered in late winter snow, to a spot marked by a stone that he had placed there 12 years before. The forensic team worked for 3 days, carefully excavating the area, recovering the remains of a child who had never gotten to send his father's Christmas present. The news of Paul Grady's arrest and confession spread across Vermont within hours. For a state that had followed the Lucas Bennett case since that terrible December afternoon 12 years before, the revelation was both a relief and a fresh wound. The mystery was solved, but the solution offered no comfort. A monster had been living among them, delivering their mail, smiling at their children, and no one had suspected a thing. David Bennett learned of the arrest from Detective Morrison, who drove to his house personally to deliver the news. She found him in the kitchen, making coffee, going through the motions of a morning routine that had become automatic over the years. He listened without expression as she explained what had been discovered, what Grady had confessed, what the forensic team had found. When she finished speaking, David was silent for a long moment. Then he asked a single question, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was the mail carrier?" "Yes," Detective Morrison confirmed. "He had been delivering to your street for 15 years. David closed his eyes. Memories flooded through him. All the times he had seen Grady walking up the driveway, the waves and nods they had exchanged, the Christmas cookies Sarah had baked for the mail carrier each year. The man who had taken their son had been inside their home, had held their mail in his hands, had stood on their porch, and wished them happy holidays. "I need to see my son," David said. The identification process was handled with extraordinary sensitivity. The remains had been transported to the state medical examiner's office, where DNA analysis had confirmed what everyone already knew. David was accompanied by a victim's advocate and a grief counselor as he viewed the evidence that had been recovered. Lucas's school ID, a fragment of the red coat he had been wearing, the comic book that had miraculously survived intact in its plastic sleeve. David held the comic book in his hands, feeling the weight of it, remembering the hours Lucas had spent at the kitchen table, tongue pressed against his upper lip in concentration. Captain Dad and the battle for Christmas. His son had created a superhero version of him, had believed so strongly in his father's ability to save the day, and David had failed him. He had been 8,000 miles away when Lucas needed him most, and he had failed. The tears came then, the first tears David had shed in years. He wept in the sterile confines of the medical examiner's office, surrounded by strangers who could never understand the depth of his grief. He wept for the son he had lost, for the years he had spent searching, for the truth that had come too late to save anyone. Sarah arrived in Vermont the next day. She and David had barely spoken in years, their divorce creating a distance that grief had not been able to bridge. But now, united by the resolution they had both sought for so long, they found themselves sitting together in the living room of the house on Maple Ridge Lane, looking at the walls still covered with David's maps and timelines and theories. "I should have walked him to the mailbox," Sarah said, the words she had repeated to herself 10,000 times over 12 years. "If I had just walked him to the mailbox, none of this would have happened." "You couldn't have known," David replied. "No one could have known. He trusted the mail carrier. We all trusted the mail carrier." They sat in silence, two parents bound together by a tragedy that had destroyed their marriage, but could never sever the deeper connection between them. They had both loved Lucas. They had both lost Lucas. And now, finally, they both knew the truth. Paul Grady was indicted on charges of kidnapping and murder. The state of Vermont announced that it would seek the maximum sentence allowed by law, though many in the community felt that no sentence could be harsh enough for what he had done. He was held without bail pending trial, confined to a cell in the same state where Lucas Bennett had spent his short life. In the weeks that followed, more details emerged about Paul Grady's history. Investigators discovered that the photographs in his hidden room depicted children from neighborhoods he had served over his 22-year postal career. Some of the children had gone missing during that time, though no direct links to Grady could be established. Cold case detectives across Vermont and neighboring states began reviewing unsolved cases, looking for connections that might have been missed. The enormity of what Grady might have done, the possibility that Lucas Bennett was not his only victim, was almost too terrible to contemplate. But the investigators pressed on, determined to bring whatever justice they could to any other families who might have been affected. David Bennett began the process of planning a funeral for his son. It had taken 12 years, but Lucas would finally have a proper burial, a place where family and friends could gather to remember him. The service was scheduled for April 15, 2024, at the church where Lucas had been baptized as an infant. The community of Burlington came together one final time for the boy who had become a symbol of their collective grief. The church was filled beyond capacity, with mourners standing in the aisles and spilling out onto the steps. Blue ribbons were everywhere, pinned to lapels, tied to wrists, attached to the flowers that surrounded Lucas's small casket. David stood at the front of the church and looked out at the faces of his neighbors, his former colleagues, the police officers who had worked the case, and the strangers who had followed the story and felt compelled to pay their respects. He had prepared remarks, had written down what he wanted to say, but the words on the paper seemed inadequate to the moment. Instead, he spoke from the heart. "Lucas was 10 years old when he was taken from us," David began, his voice rough with emotion. "He was an artist, a dreamer, a boy who loved comic books and believed in heroes. He believed in me, even when I didn't deserve it. He believed that I could save the day, that good would triumph over evil, that the world was a place where fathers came home and families stayed together and terrible things didn't happen to children walking to the mailbox." David paused, collecting himself. "I spent 12 years trying to find him. 12 years walking the street where he disappeared, studying the footage, following every lead. I told myself that I wouldn't rest until I knew what happened to my son. And now I know. I know that a monster was hiding among us, pretending to be an ordinary man, delivering our mail while harboring the darkest of secrets. I know that Lucas trusted him, because Lucas trusted everyone. That was who he was. He saw the good in people. I don't have the answers that I thought I was looking for. I don't feel the peace that I imagined would come with knowing the truth. What I feel is grief, raw and terrible, grief for my son, and for all the years we lost. But I also feel gratitude. Gratitude for the 10 years I had with Lucas. Gratitude for the detectives who never gave up on his case. Gratitude for this community, which never stopped caring about a boy who disappeared on a December afternoon. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small package. It was the envelope Lucas had been carrying that day, now sealed in protective plastic, the flag stamps still visible despite the water damage and age. "Lucas was trying to mail me this," David said, holding up the package. "It's a comic book he made about a superhero called Captain Dad. He wanted me to have it for Christmas. He never got to finish his errand." David's voice broke, and he had to stop for a moment before continuing. "I'm going to finish it for him. After the service, I'm going to walk to the mailbox at the corner of Maple Ridge Lane. I'm going to mail this package to a memorial site that's being established in Lucas's name. It's going to take 12 years longer than Lucas planned, but his comic book is finally going to reach its destination." The service concluded with a final hymn, and then the mourners filed out into the April sunshine. David waited until the church was nearly empty before gathering the package and walking to the front steps. Sarah was waiting for him there, along with Detective Vega and Detective Morrison, and dozens of community members who wanted to witness this final act. Together, they walked to the corner of Maple Ridge Lane. The mailbox was the same blue color it had been 12 years before, weathered now by more than a decade of Vermont winters. David stood in front of it, holding the package against his chest just as Lucas had done on that December afternoon. For a moment, he couldn't move. The weight of everything, all the years of searching, all the grief, all the terrible knowledge of what had happened, pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought about Lucas at 10 years old, walking this same sidewalk, excited to mail his father's Christmas present, never knowing what awaited him at this corner. Then David opened the mailbox, placed the package inside, and closed the door. The metal clanged with a sound of finality, of completion, of a mission finally accomplished. The errand that Lucas had started 12 years before was finished. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, people heading back to their cars and their homes and their lives. David stood alone at the mailbox for a long while, looking at the street where his world had ended, and then, somehow, begun again. Sarah approached him, and they stood side by side, not touching but united in this moment. "What happens now?" she asked. David considered the question. For 12 years, his entire existence had been defined by the search for Lucas. Every morning, every evening, every decision had been filtered through the lens of that mission. Now the mission was over, and he wasn't sure what remained. "I don't know," he admitted. "I never let myself think about what comes after." "Maybe that's the next thing to figure out," Sarah said. "Maybe you finally get to find out who you are without this weight." David nodded slowly. The idea seemed foreign, almost impossible, but also strangely hopeful. For the first time in 12 years, the future was not defined by what he had lost. It was open, uncertain, terrifying in its possibility. He walked home alone, passing the houses where his neighbors lived, the yards where children played, the street that would forever be associated with tragedy. But something had shifted. The obsession that had consumed him for over a decade had loosened its grip, just slightly, just enough to let in a sliver of light. Lucas was gone. That would never change. The grief would never fully heal. The wound would always be there, a scar on David's soul that he would carry until his own death. But perhaps, now that he knew the truth, he could begin to live with it. Perhaps he could honor his son's memory not through endless searching, but through finding some way forward, some purpose beyond the pain. In the months that followed, David Bennett slowly began to rebuild. He joined a support group for parents of missing children, offering his experience and empathy to others walking the path he knew so well. He worked with the detective's office to establish better protocols for investigating child disappearances, determined that other families would not have to wait 12 years for answers. He visited Lucas's grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and sitting quietly in the peace of the cemetery. The house on Maple Ridge Lane was eventually sold. David couldn't live there anymore, couldn't walk past the room that had once been his command center, couldn't look out the kitchen window at the mailbox on the corner. He moved to a small apartment on the other side of Burlington, a fresh start in a place without memories. Paul Grady was convicted of first-degree murder in October 2024. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, the maximum punishment available under Vermont law. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read, no remorse as he was led away in handcuffs. Whatever humanity he might have once possessed had been consumed long ago by the darkness inside him. The investigation into his other potential victims continued. 3 additional cases were eventually linked to Grady through DNA and other evidence, 3 more families who received the closure that had been denied them for years. 3 more children whose names could finally be spoken alongside Lucas's, their stories intertwined in tragedy. Each December 18th, the blue ribbon ceremony continued on Maple Ridge Lane. But now, instead of marking an absence, it celebrated a memory. Lucas Bennett was remembered not as the boy who vanished, but as the boy who loved art and believed in heroes. His comic book, Captain, Dad and the Battle for Christmas, was published posthumously, with proceeds going to organizations that worked to protect children and find the missing. It became a modest bestseller, purchased by people who had followed the case and wanted to honor Lucas's legacy. David attended the ceremonies now, no longer standing at the edge of the crowd, but participating, speaking, sharing his story. He talked about Lucas's life, rather than his death, about the joy his son had brought, rather than the pain of losing him. It was a small shift, but a significant one. Sarah remarried, and David found himself genuinely happy for her. They had dinner together occasionally, 2 people bound by history, no longer spouses but forever connected through the child they had created and lost. The anger and guilt that had poisoned their relationship had faded, replaced by something gentler, something that resembled forgiveness. On what would have been Lucas's 22nd birthday, David walked to the memorial site that had been established in his son's name. It was a small garden in a park near the library, filled with flowers and benches, and a bronze plaque bearing Lucas's image. Children played nearby, their laughter echoing through the trees, and David watched them with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. He thought about the package that had finally been mailed, about the comic book with its story of heroism and love. Lucas had believed that his father was a superhero, capable of overcoming any obstacle. David had never felt less heroic than during those 12 years of fruitless searching, those years of failure and despair. But maybe, he thought now, heroism wasn't about succeeding. Maybe it was about refusing to give up, about walking the same street night after night even when there was no hope left, about continuing to search even when the world told you to stop. Maybe Lucas had been right all along. David sat on one of the benches and watched the sun set over Burlington. Somewhere out there, his son's comic book was being read by children who had never known Lucas, but who would now carry a piece of him in their hearts. The letter that was never sent had finally reached its destination. 12 years late, but delivered at last. The case of Lucas Bennett would be studied in law enforcement academies for years to come, a cautionary tale about the dangers that hide in plain sight, about the importance of never giving up on cold cases, about the technology that could bring justice even when all hope seemed lost. But for David, it would always be something simpler and more profound. It would be the story of a boy who loved his father, a letter that was never sent, and the long, painful journey to bring it home. The snow began falling over Burlington as David walked back to his apartment, soft and deliberate. The same kind of snow that had fallen on that December afternoon 12 years before. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold and kept walking, one foot in front of the other, into whatever remained of his life. Behind him, the mailbox on the corner stood silent in the gathering darkness, a monument to tragedy and resilience, to love and loss, to the terrible price of trust and the eternal hope of justice. The letter that was never sent had become a story that would never be forgotten, carried forward in memory long after the last witness had passed away. Lucas Bennett was gone, but he was not forgotten. And in the end, perhaps that was the only kind of immortality that anyone could ever hope to achieve.